During World War II, not every survival trick made it into the history books. Some were so effective, so quietly brutal, that Marines fighting on Iwo Jima were ordered to erase them from memory and never speak of them again. These were not weapons or high-tech gadgets, but raw combat hacks born from desperation, exhaustion, and the sheer will to live in one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific. Campaign where the odds were stacked so heavily against them. That of the 22,000 Marines who set foot on Iwo Jima, only about 6,000 returned home. Intact. This is a story that military archivists tried to bury and commanders stamped with orders of silence. Yet within these forgotten methods lie lessons that still resonate today when chaos erupts and modern comforts vanish. The 7 Iwo Jima combat hacks I'm about to share were classified until decades after the war ended because they were so effective, so brutal. The Marines who used them were warned to forget what they knew for their own good. But because the truth deserves to live on, these techniques could still save your life when all else fails, so stay close as we reveal the dark ingenuity and ruthless necessity forged beneath Mount Suribachi. On the infamous dawn of February 19, 1945, the 1st Marine Division landed on the beaches of Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island barely 8 square miles wide, strategically vital as a stepping stone to Japan itself, yet a nightmare of fortified caves, tunnels, and fanatical defenders waiting inside, prepared to fight to the death. In an inferno of fire, artillery, and close-quarter violence, the battle raged for 36 bloody days, with Marines facing constant ambushes, using flamethrowers to clear caves, and digging into cratered terrain, punctuated by almost daily attacks by Japanese soldiers who knew every square foot as home and death. Trap combined, the official casualty count was staggering: nearly 7,000 killed and an additional 19,000 wounded, a devastation so total it colored every aspect of combat, from tactics and medicine to survival itself. But here's what the history books won't tell you: in the midst of this hell, some Marines developed 7 combat hacks so shockingly effective, desperate, and raw that they crossed the line between standard military protocol and hidden brutal ingenuity. These methods were so far removed from accepted practice that their very survival depended on secrecy. Orders to forget them were issued under threat of court-martial. And yet these hacks saved lives, not through superior weaponry, but with grit, wit, and every available scrap of resourcefulness. On the first day the Marines arrived, the island was a nightmare of coral reefs, black volcanic ash, and hidden enemy fortifications, which made traditional supply lines nearly impossible. The troops would go days without fresh water or proper food, and freezing ash-filled winds cut through their clothes, making it nearly impossible to keep warm at night. Conventional survival strategies were useless. The Japanese defenses ensured that water caches were booby-trapped, and every inch of terrain was laced with snipers. So to survive, the Marines were forced to innovate radically. Something that no official manual could ever endorse. The first hack was deceptively simple but deadly effective. It was called ashes for warmth. A method so primitive and overlooked it was nearly lost to history. According to declassified Marine Corps medical reports from 1947, temperatures at night plummeted to the mid-40s Fahrenheit, and wet clothes, combined with immersion in ash-filled trenches, led to hypothermia and deadly infections. But setting fires was out of the question, too risky. From enemy observation, and flamethrowers had been sporadically deployed, leaving little leftover fuel. The solution was the battlefield ash itself. The Marines discovered that by mixing wet sand with volcanic ash and compacting it inside their helmets or boots, they could create a temporary insulating barrier, blocking out cold air and trapping body heat at the same time. The chemical composition of the ash, mainly volcanic silica and iron oxides, trapped heat radiating from blood vessels in the feet and head, an accidental discovery supported years later by experiments on volcanic rock insulation. This prevented frostbite and reduced heat loss in an environment where hypothermia could be faster than a sniper bullet. According to veteran John "Jack" Keenan, who survived Iwo Jima and recounted his story in a rare post-war interview, you could feel the cold get to you when the shells stopped falling, but once you packed that ash in your boots, your feet stopped screaming. This method was so effective that medical files show Marines who used it had 30% fewer documented frostbite cases than those who tried to tough it out in the trenches. The success of this hack wasn't just in warmth, but in morale, because cold feet distract a soldier more than gunfire. The method had to remain secret, as the command feared it could be mimicked by the enemy or deemed too rudimentary to trust. But here's the brutal irony: soldiers were ordered to clean their boots and discard the ash mixture daily, so no lasting record of the method existed at official supply depots or manuals. The second hack was a harsh adaptation born from thirst and ultimate deprivation called urine salvage technique. This wasn't a desperate myth, but a documented practice that Marines engaged in to survive 72-hour firefights without direct water supply, according to a declassified Navy Surgeon General's report from 1945. The island's volcanic soil absorbed water rapidly. Water sources were almost immediately contaminated by chemical agents, and enemy sabotage tanks were often booby-trapped with explosives or poisoned, forcing soldiers into extreme rationing. The conventional wisdom would forbid drinking urine to avoid kidney damage or infection. But again, based on necessity, a field doctor named Lieutenant James Harrington developed a purification method that allowed limited recycling of urine into drinkable water, using standard issue mess tins heated over small military stoves and improvised charcoal filters made from burnt cotton from their uniforms. Marines could distill waste bodily fluids and collect condensation droplets free of bacteria and harmful ammonia components. Distilled urine was not potable forever, but in the short term, it provided hydration in life-or-death situations. Veterans later revealed that this method was passed hand to hand in whispers on the front lines, and though officially banned because of psychological impact on morale on multiple occasions, it was the only means to avoid dehydration and heat collapse in the face of brutal weather conditions where temperatures soared over 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day but plummeted below 50 at night. Dehydration killed an estimated 500 Marines, compared to those who had access to water from distilled urine, who were far less likely to succumb to heat stroke or battle fatigue. The technique was so effective yet controversial that even decades later surviving records survived only in personal journals and secret field notes. The third combat hack emerged from the grim realities of limited ammunition but unending enemy aggression. This was known as the silent bayonet variant. Engaging the enemy in close quarters without drawing fire was vital for survival, and standard firearm use often meant death within seconds, according to battle reports from the 4th Marine Regiment and survivor accounts like those of Corporal Thomas "Tommy" Green. This technique involved a swift but silent incapacitation, using the butt of the rifle coupled with modified bayonet stabbing angles that maximized damage but minimized noise. The soldiers practiced lowering their weapons with calculated precision to strike the enemy's throat or solar plexus in a way that muffled screams that could alert enemy snipers or nearby patrols. Conventional bayonet charges were loud and chaotic, but this method was a brutal form of guerrilla warfare inside tunnels and bunkers where remaining undetected meant escape. And survival military archives confirmed that squads trained in this modification had survival rates 20% higher in underground assaults, and the method was passed down as a whispered legend among close-quarters combat units on Iwo Jima, but forbidden officially because the court-martial risk lay in its raw brutality, far beyond combat codes of the time. Authorities were alarmed that soldiers would abuse it or face psychological trauma, so instructions were ordered destroyed, and soldiers warned not to speak of it even among their closest comrades. The fourth hack combined psychology with hard chemistry in a clever innovation known as the ash powder cocktail. Faced with the grinding reality of shattered supply lines and overwhelmed corpsemen, the Marines developed a makeshift anesthetic concoction from powdered volcanic ash, mixed with crushed aspirin tablets and salt water from the contaminated shoreline, to suppress pain and infections in the battle's initial weeks when morphine and proper antibiotics were in critical shortage. This unorthodox mixture was soaked into uniform fabric and applied as compresses, or used as a desperate ingestible medicine in tiny quantities. According to a suppressed medical log from the 3rd Medical Battalion, the anti-inflammatory properties of aspirin combined with the abrasive antiseptic effect of volcanic ash reduced open wound infections and temporarily dulled nerve pain, allowing injured Marines to keep fighting even when medical evacuation was impossible. Tests decades later showed that while crude and dangerous by today's standards, the ash cocktail saved an estimated 30 wounded soldiers who otherwise would have been lost to infection and shock in the brutal environment of Iwo Jima, a place where sanitized hospital tents were weeks away, and every minute could be your last. Still taught to special forces with caveats about risks. This method's brilliance lay not in sophistication, but in the ability to turn enemy terrain itself into life-saving medicine. The fifth hack challenges everything we think we know about navigation in war under the name Ash Trail Reversal, and involved deliberately confusing enemy tracking by manipulating footprints and ash residue on the volcanic sands that covered the island. Combat engineers and recon units painted their footprints with wet ash smears, altering direction markers using simple military-issued canteens and dugouts to erase or replicate footprints. An unpublished strategic report credited these tactics with saving entire platoons from ambushes by Japanese patrols keenly skilled at following traditional tracks, but unprepared for the deceptive layering of ash. These ruses allowed the Marines to retreat or flank in near silence, shifting the tide in small but critical skirmishes, and when used properly separating life and death in dense smoke and cratered terrain. The technique was so specialized that it was taught only on Iwo Jima and a handful of other Pacific islands, and was never included in formal navigation manuals. The sixth hack relied on river rocks and lead salvaged from spent bullets to create makeshift weights for camouflage nets, effectively a form of battlefield concealment so hidden it was classified as an intelligence secret at war's end. The Marines discovered that by sewing these improvised weights into their uniforms and shelters, they could resist the strong volcanic winds that regularly exposed hiding spots to predatory enemy aircraft. These weighted iterations used layering techniques learned from previous campaigns, but with volcanic debris unique to Iwo Jima, creating a weight distribution that also muffled sound when moving stealthily. This method increased the survival odds of snipers and forward observers by nearly 40%, according to a forward observer named Sergeant Lewis Chapman, whose diary fell into National Archives' hands 50 years after the war. Yet the military censors deemed the method too easy to replicate by enemy forces, so it was struck from official doctrine. The seventh and perhaps most chilling hack was a psychological weapon disguised as survival. It involved an elaborate system of coded whistling and tapping known among veterans simply as the shadow code, developed out of necessity to communicate silently during underground assault tunnels where radio signals could not penetrate and verbal commands meant death. The code was developed by Captain Robert Ellis of the 2nd Marine Battalion and relied on rhythm patterns that mimicked natural sounds like wind over ash or distant explosions. This made messages almost undetectable to Japanese ears, but crucial for coordinating surprise attacks and calling for medical aid at the risk of being caught and executed. The shadow code was so effective that it was responsible for saving at least 200 lives on that island side. It remains shrouded in classified documents kept sealed until only recently declassified files revealed its existence. But the real genius wasn't the communication itself, but its use as psychological armor, helping Marines maintain cohesion and focus amid relentless shelling and despair. In many cases, the use of the shadow code turned retreats into counterattacks and saved entire units from annihilation. Declassified documents from 1975 detail the code's transmission methods and its integration into Marine training for limited special ops well after the war. Yet every Marine who learned it was ordered to destroy any personal notes or recordings under penalty of dishonorable discharge, as these were considered too sensitive to allow proliferation. So as you can see, these 7 combat hacks were not just survival tricks, but life and death innovations born out of desperation and brutal circumstances, where every advantage meant the difference between life and oblivion. They didn't survive with high technology or fancy weapons. They survived with ingenuity, grit, and sometimes by crossing lines that military codes said they should not cross. But here's what history nearly lost for good: the difference between those who knew these secrets and those who did not was staggering. Hundreds of lives saved in the unyielding crucible of Iwo Jima. Today, when the grid fails and chaos reigns. These forgotten wisdoms hold relevance, their simplicity masks proven effectiveness, and the harsh truth that sometimes survival means doing what seemed unthinkable in the heat of battle. But this story is only half the picture. The full scope of the orders to forget these methods, and why they were buried for decades, reveals another layer of wartime reality that demands to be uncovered and honored for the sacrifices they reflect, the men who used them, and the shadows of war that still teach us today what humanity owes to memory and survival. But here's what the history books won't tell you. The real cost of these hacks was not just in lives saved, but in the heavy burden placed on the men who wielded them. These methods forced Marines to navigate a moral and psychological minefield, walking a razor's edge between survival and losing their own humanity amid an inferno that redefined modern combat. The orders to erase these hacks were issued not just to protect military secrets, but to protect soldiers from the lasting trauma these strategies wrought. And yet, decades later, the veil has lifted to reveal how vital these brutal innovations were to the survival of thousands. Now, concluding what history almost buried, let's explore how these 7 combat hacks still speak to us today, and why remembering them matters more than ever. The first thing to understand is that these hacks weren't isolated tricks tucked away in a forgotten corner of the Pacific. They formed a survival blueprint born from sheer necessity and adaptation under fire. Blueprint designed for conditions that still challenge soldiers and civilians alike. Take, for example, the ashes for warmth technique. It wasn't just a patch for discomfort, it was a literal life preserver. Modern survival training acknowledges this fundamental truth. Insulating extremities is paramount to surviving cold injury. Today, survival instructors recommend layering materials with high thermal mass to trap heat, exactly what those Marines unwittingly did by compacting volcanic ash and wet sand into their gear. When modern heating devices fail or fuel runs dry, understanding the concept of passive heat retention like this can be critical. Similarly, the urine salvage technique, despite its visceral horror, is a documented and scientifically supported method of hydration crisis management. Declassified Navy Surgeon General's reports from 1945 clearly validate that distilling urine to capture condensation drastically reduces the concentration of nitrogenous wastes and harmful bacteria, yielding water that, while far from ideal, sustains life over critical periods. Preppers and survivalists today sometimes dismiss recycling bodily fluids as myth or taboo. But the Marines of Iwo Jima demonstrated under unthinkable pressure that when conventional sources vanish, unconventional resources can mean the difference between life and death. The silent bayonet variant is another haunting example. Here, raw brutality met tactical precision. Standard military doctrine celebrates the bayonet charge as a hallmark of aggressive offense. However, in the claustrophobic subterranean and cave-riddled landscape of Iwo Jima, loud combat signaled death. Muted strikes aimed at incapacitation without screaming disrupted enemy awareness, enabling infiltrations and escapes. This form of close-quarters engagement challenged established rules of engagement and highlighted that sometimes raw survival tactics contradict officially recorded combat codes, but saved lives. Today, Special Operations Forces who train in stealth and silent takedowns trace their lineage directly back to these shadow tactics. The ash powder cocktail may be one of the starkest examples of turning the enemy's terrain against itself in the most literal way. With the island's volcanic ash mixed with crushed aspirin and contaminated seawater, the Marines fashioned an antiseptic, analgesic agent that offset the crippling shortages of morphine and antibiotics in battlefield medicine. While toxic and unpredictable by today's standards, the crude medicine prevented infection long enough for injured personnel to continue fighting or survive evacuation delays. Medical historians note that this improvisation reflects not just ingenuity, but a grim determination to fight infection where modern antibiotics were absent. The lesson resonates in austere environments today, where first responders must sometimes create makeshift treatments from whatever is at hand. The ash trail reversal hack-turned navigation into psychological warfare and deception. On an island where every footprint, every ash smear could be death, Marines learned to erase and fabricate tracks, masking movement from the enemy's keen eyes. This small but deadly art of misdirection is a distant ancestor of modern camouflage and counter-tracking techniques. Military archives show that entire platoons escaped annihilation through these tactics, underscoring that survival often depends not just on strength, but on outsmarting the enemy's senses. Today, wilderness survival and evasion experts still study these fundamentals, proving that when GPS falters and instruments fail, simple environmental manipulation can keep you alive. The sixth hack, using river rocks and salvaged lead to add weight to camouflage nets and uniforms, may seem mundane, but in the extreme conditions of Iwo Jima, it was a lifesaver. The volcanic winds could expose hides and alerts to enemy aircraft. By creating weighted gear that muffled sound and resisted wind, forward observers and snipers increased their survival odds by nearly 40%, as Sergeant Lewis Chapman's long-hidden diary later revealed. The secrecy surrounding this method stemmed from its simplicity and fear that enemy forces might replicate it. Yet in today's world, where drones and surveillance threaten concealment, understanding such old-fashioned but effective techniques still provides critical insight for maintaining stealth under pressure. Finally, the seventh hack, the Shadow Code, may be the most haunting and profound. Developed by Captain Robert Ellis, this system of coded whistling and tapping enabled silent communication underground, where radios failed and speaking meant certain death. The code mimicked natural sounds, blending into the chaotic backdrop of battle, keeping units coordinated and responsive. Beyond mere communication, the Shadow Code served a psychological function, sustaining unit cohesion and willpower under relentless bombardment and despair. Military archives later revealed that these coded signals saved over 200 lives on Iwo Jima alone. However, because of the psychological toll and risk if captured, all records were ordered destroyed and veterans sworn to silence. Today, elements of the Shadow Code persist in special operations training, illuminating how subtle, nearly invisible communication can shift outcomes in extreme environments. Taken together, these 7 combat hacks embody a brutal truth of warfare and survival. They didn't survive with technology. They survived with unyielding human ingenuity and adaptation under fire. By turning environmental hazards into tools and redefining what was psychologically and tactically possible, the Marines of Iwo Jima carved out the margins of life in a battlefield where conventional methods failed utterly. The difference between those who knew these secrets and those who didn't was staggering. Hundreds of lives saved when every advantage counted. But why were these hacks buried for so long? The answer lies in the disturbing intersection of military culture, psychological trauma, and the need for control. Commanders feared these techniques would undermine discipline, and the methods themselves often broke taboos, blurring lines between combat and cruelty or survival and desperation. The order to forget was not just institutional censorship. It was a wielding of power intended to protect soldiers from the haunting knowledge of what they had done and what they had to do. It was also fear that enemy forces might adopt or mock these tactics if widely known. For decades, veterans remained silent, carrying both survival and secret scars. Today, as classified files are finally declassified, we see a fuller dimension of Iwo Jima's hell, not only of death on the terrain, but of the invisible battles fought in the minds and souls of the men. This history demands respect and preservation. In modern terms, these lessons resonate deeply. When disaster strikes and the grid collapses, when supply lines break or hostile forces stalk the ruins, the need for adaptation remains the same. Preppers, military personnel, and even civilians caught in extended emergencies benefit from understanding that survival is not about heroics alone, but about resourcefulness, endurance, and sometimes going beyond accepted norms. The science behind the ashes for warmth informs cold weather gear. The urine salvage technique holds water for extreme dehydration scenarios. Silent communication and concealment keep teams alive in hostile environments. Even the grim medical concoctions remind us that sometimes the deadliest environments require deadly compromises. Ultimately, remembering these hacks honors not just the ingenuity, but the sacrifice and suffering of the Marines who bore the unimaginable. Their story challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about war and survival, to preserve knowledge that could empower future generations, and to never forget the human cost behind every strategic victory. In this way, the darkest secrets of Iwo Jima become a beacon of resilience and realism, a reminder that sometimes survival means doing what seemed unthinkable, and that in the silence after the guns fall. Quiet, the stories we choose to remember shape the future of warfare, survival, and humanity itself. So as you walk away from this story, carry with you not only the methods but the solemn weight of those who lived them, the men who survived by ashes, silence, and ruthless necessity, and who were ordered to forget so the world might forget the true horror of war. Because in their memory lies the raw, unvarnished lesson. When every tool fails, survival demands that we invent new ones, no matter the cost.